Hi, this is Boki, and today I am going to do my reading wrap-up for May. May was a much better reading month for me than the last month was. If you remember my reading from last month, you will recall that I read 0 books. So really, even if I had run like 1 book, depending on how you do the calculus, I would have been infinitely better off this month than I was last month, but luckily I did even better than that. Even better, I loved a lot of the books that I read this month, so I feel like May really redeemed itself for me. So usually I do my wrap-ups in categories of like books that I liked the least, then the ones that I was kind of like meh on, then books that I liked, and then books that I loved. So the first book that I'm going to talk about, I wasn't sure it was like an okay-ish book or if it was a book that I liked. I feel like it's sort of in the middle. So this book is told from the point of view of Caleb, a teenage boy who was brought up by this spy agency to become what's called a love interest. So basically he and this other boy, Dylan, they are supposed to be competing for the affections of this teenage girl who this agency has deemed to be like of interest. Like she's really smart, she's apparently been like inventing crazy things since she was in elementary school. So I guess now as like a high schooler, she's supposed to be a prime target for this kind of love triangle situation to like get, I don't know, an informant in there. Caleb is brought up to be this nice guy. Dylan is brought up to be a bad boy. There's a whole manufactured love triangle, and one of them is supposed to win her affection, and whoever doesn't will be killed. So it is like a very, very intense love triangle. And when I've seen the summary floating around a few times, it sounded like it had the potential to be really clever, and it also sounded like it had the potential to be really frustrating. And what really sold me on reading it, as I think a post that I saw going around maybe on Tumblr, talking about how it was this really great send-up of a lot of YA tropes, and I love kind of meta things. I love like things like Cabin in the Woods, the Joss Whedon horror movie, like things that really play with the tropes of genre. So yeah, I thought it definitely had a lot of really interesting ideas that it wanted to play with, especially in the beginning when they're setting up this whole agency, they're setting up this whole premise. There's a lot of really interesting things about gender, especially how, like, I guess guys are maybe portrayed in YA in these types of love interest molds. So I thought I had a lot of really interesting ideas, but it was also written in a way that I thought was kind of representative of what I can tend to find very frustrating about a certain kind of YA style. And I don't really know how to describe it other than it's just like very cheesy. Like it feels a lot like adults trying to write teenagers. I just wasn't crazy about the dialogue. I wasn't crazy about the inner monologue, but I did like where the book went with a lot of the tropes. I spent a lot of time wondering if it was going to go in a certain direction, and it did, and I'm so glad that it did. So I think if the book sounds interesting to you, I would recommend giving it a shot, especially if you're someone who loves YA but also loves meta things. I think this book might be really interesting to you to read, and you might like have enough familiarity with that kind of YA style that like a lot of those issues that for me tend to like get in the way of my reading, they might not stand out as much for you. Because I don't think that's a knock against YA writing. It's just a thing that I can't really deal with for long periods of time. So moving on from that is just a whole bunch of books that I loved. Starting with the books that I actually listened to in the beginning of the month, and these were 2 Carrie Fisher audiobooks. The first was The Princess Diarist, which is basically her talking about her time filming Star Wars, and also her including some of her diary entries from that time. Then the other audiobook I listened to was Wishful Drinking, where she talks a lot just kind of about herself, about her history in Hollywood, her family's history in Hollywood, and just some of the crazy things that have happened to her, or that also a lot of her own mental health issues. Both of these audiobooks that I listened to off of Audible are narrated by her. In The Princess Diarist, the chapters that are coming from her own diary are actually narrated by her daughter, Billie Lourd. I've been wanting to read her books for a while, and I definitely wanted to listen to her audiobooks as well, because I'm really starting to enjoy audiobooks that are narrated by the people who wrote them. Carrie Fisher especially has a really distinctive voice, and hearing her read her own writing I think is an incredibly special experience. Her voice is something that should be just kind of commemorated, like in writing and speaking. It's just incredibly thoughtful. It's like, but also very humorous. I think just the way that she reflects on herself and her own life is kind of a level of self-awareness that would be both challenging but also really special. I think very meaningful to a lot of people. Like I think I just kind of came out of it understanding more about the impact that she's had on a a lot of people. So next up is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And this is a book about a set of three kids, Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy, who grew up in a boarding school in England. I think it's kind of like post-warish, maybe 60s or 70s. This book is told from the point of view of Kathy, who's telling the reader about, you know, the period of time that they spent growing up in the boarding school, some of the time after, and kind of their feelings about it when they've reunited after that whole period in their life, to realize a lot of truths about their experiences there. And I kind of knew some of the twists and turns that the story was going to take before I got into the book. I don't think that knowing them ruined my experience, but I don't want to get too spoilery about it, just in case it's something that you're interested in reading in and it might kind of ruin your experience. But this is definitely a book that I wish I could do a more in-depth discussion of. If I had more time to kind of like flesh out my thoughts for a proper review slash discussion, I definitely would. Basically, there's kind of a fundamental secret at the core of this boarding school that does get revealed very early on in the book, but then kind of translates into more downstream effects and more downstream secrets that you find out more towards the end. Like, there's a lot of things that are imbued with more meaning as the book unfolds. But at its core, it is a story about these three friends, and it is really beautifully done. I enjoyed, especially Kathy's character, seeing her try to navigate kind of the truths of what they learned as children, both truths that are, you know, universal, things that we all have to learn as children, and things that are very specific to their circumstances, and how those interact and really carry with them through their adulthood. There's a whole thing about art and science and the intersection of them, like in this book, that I really wish I could talk more about it. Basically, I don't have my thoughts formed enough, but it's really fascinating, and at some point, hopefully if I have more time in the future, I can think it more out loud and maybe talk about that. Next up is Antony and Cleopatra by Shakespeare, and this was recommended to me by Crystal Marsh, and I will link to her channel below. It was kind of a weird experience because this is definitely a play where I think it's expected of the audience that they know a lot of stuff about Antony and Cleopatra, that they'll know the battles that are being referenced, that they'll know a lot of the kind of power dynamics at play, and I didn't come in with a lot of that knowledge. There were helpful footnotes to sort of figure stuff out, but that was something that for me was a little bit harder to get into because I am very used to like the plays that I've read in high school from Shakespeare where there's like a clear plot, like Romeo and Juliet. You don't have to know that much external history to like follow along with what's going on. Antony and Cleopatra is not that straightforward, but the characters are so fascinating and kind of the dynamics that are at play, especially Cleopatra, of course. Like, she's this fascinating combination of like sensuality and power, and then like being in hysterics and being extremely emotional. So I just really loved seeing her interactions, especially with her attendants, who were all just like, oh my god, like, what are you doing? It was really enjoyable. This is definitely something that I also want to come back to in the future and maybe do a little bit more examination of maybe do a little bit more reading of the history and get more out of it, because I really loved it. I didn't completely understand what was going on, but what I did understand, I did really enjoy. Next up is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. So Sarah Waters, I think, is probably best known for writing Fingersmith, which I really loved, so I've been wanting to read more of her books. So I decided to pick this up from the library. It is basically told from the point of view of Dr. Faraday, who is a country doctor whose life sort of gets intertwined with this family, the Ayres family, who occupy Hundred Hall, which used to be this like grand estate and has now been going into some massive disrepair. This book takes place in the UK in the 1940s, I think, or like post-World War II. I think either post-World War I or World War II. Basically, like, this whole country is in transition, and that manifests in a lot of different ways, how people are viewing this estate, what kind of people are getting what kind of jobs, and then just in this family, the Ayres family itself, as they're watching their position in society change and watching their own family kind of fall apart, how all that kind of plays into the historical transition, but even more importantly, in a really weird ghost story. Like Fingersmith, there's like clear narrative kind of conclusions to what's happening. That's not necessarily something you're gonna always get with this book, but it's not really what the book is seeking. The book is not seeking a conclusion to what is happening necessarily. What it's about is like what is happening to this family and why are they so susceptible to what is going on in their household, whatever it is. And Dr. Faraday, his whole world ends up getting incredibly entwined in this family as well, and it's fascinating to watch how his perspective shifts as he gets more and more kind of integrated into the weird drama and like psychodrama and horror of this household. And the last book I want to talk about is Next Gen PhD by Melanie v. Sinche, and this book is very different from everything else I've been talking about. I might do a separate whole not my thesis video about this, but this book is, as its subtitle says, a guide to career paths in science. I'm going to just talk about it here very quickly. Basically, if you are considering grad school in any kind of science field, if you are already in grad school, if you are doing a postdoc, I would highly recommend checking this book out. It has a lot of different resources for figuring out what kind of job you want, whether it's academia, not academia, research, not research, all of these things. It also has a lot of helpful information on networking, how to do informational interviews, things like sending emails, which to me is still kind of one of the hardest parts of this whole job thing, is figuring out how to email strangers and what to say in them, and like how to conduct interviews, how to dress, all of this really helpful information that I wish I had read like 5 years ago, but even now, like at the point that I'm at, is really, really helpful. So I highly recommend it if you are in a position where you think this book will be relevant to you and your career interests. In addition to books, sometimes I like to talk about TV, and I actually watched 3 TV shows this month. I finished 3 TV shows. First up is Goblin, which I mentioned in my last video and that I will probably be posting a review of pretty soon. This is a Korean drama about a goblin from like the 900 years ago in Korean history who he was this old general and he was killed but sort of brought back to life as a goblin and has been waiting 900 years to find his bride who will be able to pull a sword out of him and he will be able to die. The show is incredibly popular. I understand why it's popular. I also don't think it was completely well done. I thought it was really fun and really enjoyable, and there's a whole side plot with like Grim Reapers and reincarnation that I really loved. But there's a lot about this show that I think is problematic. So I will post that review of it soon, and if you want to talk about it more there, we can. Another show though, oh my god, The Keepers. Okay, if you've watched The Keepers like on Netflix, tell me below, tell me what you thought. The Keepers is this true crime show that just got put up on Netflix. It's a Netflix original show, I believe. It's about this nun in the 60s who was killed. She was working at a Catholic school, and some of the students there, now a whole bunch of decades later, have been sort of investigating her death. But as they're investigating it, another kind of facet of this story that becomes very apparent is that there was a really horrible pedophile / sexual abuse ring going on at that school, and the story of that ends up kind of dominating the series in a way that I think is really, really well done. It's done very much from the point of view of the victims and their process that they went when they were undergoing those traumas, their process of recovering a lot of what had been done to them, trying to go up against the Catholic Church, trying to deal with the city that was supposed to be helping them. There's just so many parts to this story that it's really intense. It can be very difficult to watch. If sexual assault is something that's very triggering for you, I would especially be cautious of episodes 2 and 3 where it can get very graphic, and maybe with the documentary overall, but especially those episodes. There are just so many emotions like wrapped up in singular moments. Like there are moments where you're both so devastated for the victims of these crimes, but you're also like very grateful for the people around them who did come through for them, like members of their family who were incredibly supportive in the face of like accusations against an institution that had been so integral to their family dynamic. But then at the same time, you're also like really upset because of the number of institutions that have failed them, and it's just so intense and just so good, and I highly recommend that you watch it if you've been thinking about it. The other show that I watched this month is Riverdale, which was, I really wanted more for this show. I feel like this show was like a light version of Veronica Mars. Like it really wanted to be like edgy and like kind of suggestive of some like real shit going down, but then it didn't really want to go there. I think the show's only saving grace was that it was 13 episodes long. Riverdale, if you don't know, is based on the Archie comics, but it's like supposed to be the dark twisted version, where there's a murder mystery and everyone's dark secrets come to light. Yeah, it was okay. I watched it because, like I said, it was only 13 episodes. I was working on presentations, and sometimes I like dumb TV up on my screen when I'm working on presentations, but like, man, this was rough at times. Archie is like a black hole of charisma. Betty and Jughead never made sense as a couple. None of the couples ever made sense. Like, people would hook up and you're like, why? Why? Okay, so I was just editing my video, and apparently when I filmed this a few days ago, my camera decided to cut out like mid Riverdale relationship rant, which is probably for the best. I don't know if it was really the most necessary rant, so also pretty close to the end of my video, so I just wanted to quickly just hop back onto a camera, hopefully it doesn't crap out again, and just say that, yeah, like overall May was a good reading month. It was a good TV month too. If you read any of these books or watched any of these shows and you want to talk about it, you can either comment below or we can talk on Twitter or Instagram, and yeah, bye.